Why do you think it is that when you get food stories in the media, it tends to be a food scare story rather than a food positive story?
Well, the whole point of journalism is to be a lookout on the ship of state. That's the line that Joseph Pulitzer gave. And if you're a lookout on the ship of state, you're not looking for good things, you're looking for icebergs that are going to smash the ship, sink everybody, and cause mayhem and tragedy. So studies that feed this sense of alarm are what journalists look for. It's a kind of precautionary principle. The problem is that even though journalism and science seem to be aiming towards the same thing, truth, the way they go about that search is completely different. To journalism, something that's new is news. And there are criteria for, validating the news. You get a quote from one person, you get a quote from another person. Fairness, in fact, becomes a sufficient measure of truth. But something new in science, a new study, especially a new study that seems to run against everything we thought we knew about something, that's inherently suspect. That's not new, that's not true until you get the second study, until it's been replicated.
Mm-hmm. By which time it's not interesting news
By
to,
which
to
time,
spread.
and this is a pattern we see all the time, the follow-up studies are never covered. The reassurance that, you know what, this study was wrong for these reasons, that never makes the dialogue. So you have an endless cycle of, look, there's an iceberg, look, there's an iceberg, look, there's an iceberg. And in fact, what you're actually getting in scientific terms are snowflakes.
Are there any specific examples that you've got to illustrate this iceberg mentality?
Yes, there's a great example of this in food. Several years ago, a study came out about PCBs, which we all think are bad, in farmed salmon. And the study was in a very prestigious journal, and it got worldwide attention because what the researchers did is they looked at PCB levels in farmed salmon around the world. And they said, increased risk of cancer. When you actually looked at the way they modeled the risk, it turned out to be this. You would have to eat 8 ounces of raw salmon with the skin on. You couldn't cook it because that would remove most of the PCBs. You had to keep the skin because that's where the PCBs were in the fat below the skin. You would have to eat 8 ounces of raw salmon per month for 70 years in order to have a 1 in 100,000 risk of cancer. A lot of scientists got very upset, so Harvard School of Public Health did a study, took another 2 years, and they concluded, based on a more careful analysis of the data, that you were actually more at risk from not eating salmon than you could ever possibly be by eating salmon with a tiny amount of PCBs in it. So that's the kind of horrible advice the public can get if journalists simply take every new study claiming a disaster is at hand at purely face value.
So how would you suggest that journalists should go about reporting stories like this for a more responsible type of journalism?
Well, it's very difficult because the way science establishes credibility is completely different to the narrative of a news story. But there's a lot of academic research on what journalists should actually do, and they should start with the context of where the study falls. How does this study relate to all the other studies that have been done on this topic? And in the case of so many of the scares we're bombarded with, these studies don't stand up against what's known as the weight of evidence. What already exists is much more likely to be true. And that's why this sort of context of the weight of evidence is possibly the most vital thing that a journalist can do in writing about these stories. I suspect as a journalist it would mean most of these stories shouldn't be in print.
Is this a problem for the journalist, or is this a problem for the editor?
It's a problem for both. One of the things that we found is that given the problems in the media, actually dedicated science journalists have been disappearing as a breed. Very often journalists with just general knowledge experience are covering science, and they don't know the politics behind the science, they don't know how to analyze the study methodology, they don't know how to interpret statistics, because all of this is not part, typically, of a journalist's training. Journalists typically don't come from the sciences. They come from the arts and humanities. And as I know, certainly I chose to do arts and humanities because I didn't want to spend my time immersed in numbers and chemicals and elements and very complicated data. But my journey over the past decade has been towards a real appreciation of seeing the world through numbers, seeing numbers as almost like people in a story, doing certain things, sometimes doing bad things, sometimes doing good things. And it's very difficult without a lot of education, a lot of training, and also a willingness to admit that you're getting a lot of this stuff wrong in order to improve the overall quality of journalism.